when it comes time to save Jews, that's not a time for anava, for humility.
Welcome to Prism of Torah with Rebbe Saf Aaron Prisman, engaging Divrei Torah, packed with stories and practical insights. Find us wherever you get your podcasts or at prismoftorah.org.
Shalom Uvracha. In this week's Parshas Shemos, HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself to Moshe Rabbeinu in a very interesting and unique scene. There's a low thorn bush, totally occupied with flames, with fire. And the bush is not being consumed. Moshe Rabbeinu sees this interesting scene, realizes something interesting and sacred is going on over here, and indeed, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Shekhinah, appeared to him and has a dialogue with him, trying to convince him to be the leader of the Jewish people. Question number one is, why such imagery? Why a fire with a bush, and to make it very not natural, miraculous that the bush is not being consumed? Question number two, what is going on over here? Moshe Rabbeinu keeps making excuses why he does not want to take this role on. And he says, Shlach be'ad tishlach, found someone else. I don't think I'm fitting because I'm kvad peh v'kvad lashon. I have a lisp. It's not my team that I'll be the leader. And how can that be? This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu asking to do something. Why is he being so reluctant? So I want to share with you an idea I saw many years ago, and unfortunately I don't remember where I saw this. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Samech Zayin Amud Aleph, teaches us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose Dafka the thorn bush because it is the lowest of all trees, a symbol of anava, humility. Yet fire, Reb Chaim Vital explains in Shari Kedusha, represents the opposite. The element of fire rising upward, you can understand, is symbolic of gaiva, arrogance and pride. Moshe, who the Torah testifies is anav mikol adam, was the most modest person. He was very worried. He understood that if he takes upon himself such a leadership role to be in charge of the Jewish people, take them out of Mitzrayim, which indeed he did at the end, he was very worried that position would lower his spiritual elevation, would bring him down. As Chazal tell us, that one of the things that takes you out of this world is gaiva. He was very, very worried. This was the biggest danger for him. The whole point of life is to grow spiritual, and he was worried he's going to totally mess that up by taking on this role. HaKadosh Baruch Hu preempted that. And that is exactly what he was symbolizing to Moshe Rabbeinu. Look, the sneh represents humility, modesty. The fire represents gaiva. Misvar, you can understand why fire represents gaiva. It always wants to go up, as opposed to the bush, it's always down. And yet, miraculously, the gaiva, the fire, the arrogance, is not affecting the bush representing anava, humility. And that's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to send a message to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, you should know, if a person does something, although it's a very mechubad position, a lot of honor people get for certain positions, but if you take on that position because you know that's Ratzon Hashem, it will not negatively affect your modesty, your anava. I said this over to a friend of mine, Rav Ephraim Rubin, and he told me, it reminds me of a pasuk in Tehillim. The pasuk in Tehillim is Perik Lamed Daled, pasuk Gimel, as it says, "Bahashem titalel nafshi, ishmeu anavim v'yismachu," which literally translates to, "My soul shall glory in Hashem, the humble shall hear and be glad," which means that if the only source of gaiva, of pride, is that you're connected to Hashem and you're doing Ratzon Hashem, then even the humble will be happy. It's not a contradiction. You have to have the right motivation and the right frame of mind when you take upon yourself something that could be interpreted as very mechubad, chashuv, and gaivadik. But if you do it for the right reasons, it's not going to negatively affect your level of modesty. Hence, even the modest people, representing humility, can rejoice in such cases. And that's what the pasuk is saying. Ba'ashem titalel nafshi. If the only reason for pride and for gaiva is coming because you feel you're connected to Hashem and you're doing Ratzon Hashem, that is good. And that's not going to affect your modesty, but you have to have that frame of mind because you realize you're nothing. And the only source and rationale for being gaiva is because you're connected to Hashem, that you're part of the chosen nation and you're doing Ratzon Hashem, and that's what life was planned to be, for you to have an opportunity to do Ratzon Hashem. In your good hands. All we have to do is be focused that everything we take upon ourselves, even though it might be interpreted on the outside like it's a gaiva thing, if our motivation is purely to do Ratzon Hashem, then it won't negatively affect our level of modesty, and we'll be able to live life the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu designed it to be. I want to share with you a story that my friend Reb Eli Kempf helped me find, and I think it's perfect, and you'll see why, for the topic we're dealing about. And he heard it from Reb Shlomo Fari. The Belzer Rebbe, that was a young boy outside of the house of his father. They were playing and making a lot of noise, screaming, shouting. So they got called in from the house. The kid comes in, and the father says that his grandfather wants to speak to him. His grandfather was one of the earliest rabbis of the Belzer Rebbe. So this kid goes in front of this grandfather, who was called the Sar Shalom, and he sits in front of the Sar Shalom. His grandfather, at this point in life, is very old, is already blind, and is already thinking of all of thoughts in Torah. What else does he have to do? He can't even see. You can imagine. When he's blind, the only thing he can do is think, and his hearing becomes more sensitive, and hence, suddenly he hears all this noise. Of course, he didn't scream, he didn't do anything. He just calmly called the grandson in. Doesn't yell at him, nothing. Come sit on my lap, he says. The kid climbs up to his grandfather's lap and asks him, did you learn anything today in school? The kid says, yes, I learned about Moshe Rabbeinu, and I learned about the sneh, the burning bush. He says, okay, did you understand what you learned? The kid says, the truth is I didn't totally understand what was going on there. His grandfather says, well, what didn't you understand? So he says, I didn't understand that Moshe Rabbeinu was called to be a leader. Hashem says, Moshe, I want to send you to be the leader. And Moshe says, Shlach na be'ati shlach, na, send someone else. I have a speech impediment. He gives him all sorts of excuses and reasons why he's not appropriate to be the leader. And what does the pasuk say? Vayichar af Hashem b'Moshe. HaKadosh Baruch Hu got upset with Moshe Rabbeinu. Hashem says, what? You're worried about a speech impediment? Who teaches people to speak? Who gives them a tongue to be able to speak, to talk? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what are you worried about? And therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu got upset with him. This grandson, this kid, asks his grandpa, I don't understand. Why was Hashem angry with Moshe for being humble, for being an anav? Isn't being humble, modesty, such a beautiful thing that a leader has to be? Such a magnificent thing? Why is Hashem upset at Moshe? Hashem should be happy with Moshe. So this grandfather, the Sar Shalom, what does he answer him? I want you to hear something that you're going to remember forever, he says to him. You'll remember this, and you're not going to understand it now, but the time will come, and you'll understand it. The kid looks at his grandfather, and his grandfather continues and says, when it comes time to save Jews, that's not a time for anava, for humility. When it comes time to save Jews, now is not the time for humility. Hashem was upset with Moshe because it's great to be an anav and a modest person, but not now. You need to have a different path. Now you need to have the tiny bit of gaiva. I'm going to add, the Gemara says that Moshe Rabbeinu had shminis sheba shminis. That's 1 divided by 64 of gaiva. And it's probably the gaiva we're talking about, the healthy gaiva that HaKadosh Baruch Hu got you to do something, and you're doing Ratzon Hashem. That tiny bit of arrogance, of pride, the tiniest bit to be able to say, if Hashem appointed me, if Hashem said this is my job, then that is healthy gaiva. That's not going to affect my modesty. I have to stand up and I have to do the job. And if Hashem is telling me to do the job, and I have all the reasons in the world why I can't, then on a certain level, it's a chisaron in believing in HaKadosh Baruch Hu and knowing and realizing that that type of arrogance is not a negative arrogance. It's believing that you're doing Ratzon Hashem, and it's not going to affect your modesty. When this grandson leaves the room, the father asks him, what did Grandpa say? What did he say? And this kid said, later on in his life, I looked at my father and I couldn't remember. It flew out of my head. It was just 2 seconds ago, but I was drawing a blank. I didn't understand. But I went on. I was a kid. I went to play. Years passed, and my grandpa passed away, and then my father became the rabbi. When my father became the rabbi, I learned from my father, but then my father passed away. And then I, at a relatively young age, was asked to sit on a seat, on the throne of being the grand rabbi of all of the Belzer Hasidus. And I thought to myself, how could I sit in that place? How could I sit in my father's chair? How could I sit in my grandfather's chair? I don't know the Torah that they knew. I don't have the Yirat Shamayim that they had. I felt inadequate. And when they asked me that, and it was time for me to sit on that chair, all of a sudden, for the first time since that day, he said, I remembered what my grandpa said to me. I sat on his lap as a child. That, when it comes time to save the Jewish people, now is not a time for anava. It's not a time for modesty. In short, he realized, this Belzer Rebbe, that the fire of leadership when fueled by Hashem's command, or it's Ratzon Hashem, leaves the thorn bush of the self and modest intact. Have a good Shabbos.
This concludes another episode of the Prism of Torah. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something valuable. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast and give a 5-star rating. You can also find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts or our own website, prismoftorah.com, where we have a full archive of all our past episodes. We would like to thank Yona Vefa for the recording equipment and Ellie Podcast Productions for handling all our post-podcast productions. Join us next week for another enlightening conversation on the Prism of Torah.